The gavel had barely finished echoing before the accusations flew like a blade across the room. In the tense stillness of the courtroom, Officer Ethan Morales thrust out a finger at the black woman seated motionless at the defense table and delivered each word as though he had just survived a life-or-death assault. For a brief moment, the packed courtroom seemed to fall into a suspended quiet, leaving only the cold voice of a man who believed his uniform granted him the authority to define truth itself. Naomi Carter sat poised back straight, her deep eyes unsettlingly calm. No one in the room knew what she was thinking, yet every small movement, even the way she set her pen down on her notes, radiated a level of control that was absolute. No trembling, no reaction. Only the quiet surface of a lake threatened by a storm gathering somewhere beyond the horizon. Ethan took a step forward, shoulders rigid beneath his police uniform, the fluorescent lights catching badges that had intimidated countless people before. His voice grew louder as he listed the reasons Naomi was dangerous, aggressive, disrespectful, twisting the events of that night into a narrative polished like a script he had rehearsed over and over. A faint stir moved through the courtroom. The prosecutor leaned forward as if in agreement. A few people in the audience nodded slightly, as though accustomed to believing a 38-year-old white officer over a 42-year-old black woman in a plain blazer. But beneath the table, Naomi's finger brushed against her notebook, a movement so small no one noticed. In that split second, she understood that every accusation he threw was becoming evidence of something far larger, deeper, and far more dangerous for Ethan Morales himself. Judge Harrison Blake's brow creased when Ethan insisted his body camera had suddenly malfunctioned. The judge said nothing, though his pen stalled mid-air. Something didn't align. Even so, Ethan pressed on, his voice growing faster, louder, carrying the confidence of a man convinced he still controlled the stage. What no one knew was that beneath his steady exterior lurked a vague flicker of fear. With every lie he layered on, a thin trace of fragility flashed in his eyes. He could not understand why the woman before him did not flinch, did not shout, did not beg. She only watched him with a calm, too steady, too quiet, as if she were waiting for him to walk himself straight into an abyss. Naomi remained still, but inside the memory of the night she had been stopped on the road, sharpened with painful clarity. She remembered the sound of wind slicing past the window as she pulled over exactly as the law required, the red lights flaring behind her, the shift in Ethan's expression when he saw the address on her license, and the way his voice changed, sliding from neutral to suspicious to hostile, simply because she answered too politely for what he expected from a black woman living in an affluent neighborhood. The sting of injustice was still there, but here in this courtroom, it had hardened into a cold resolve. Naomi understood she was not merely a framed defendant. She was the key to a door the Riverside Police Department never wanted anyone to open. Ethan continued painting her as volatile, uncontrollable. Occasionally he glanced at the jury and caught eyes watching him intently, fueling his arrogance and convincing him he was winning. The more he spoke, the smoother the lies became, each false statement wrapped in just enough professional polish to fool anyone who didn't know better. But Ethan failed to notice that truth was already slipping quietly into the room through cracks he could not seal. It lived in the notes Naomi had taken, in the judge's wary gaze, in the sudden tension when a few people in the audience exchanged uncertain looks. And it lived in the steady calm of the woman he believed was his weakest prey. Naomi sat with her hand resting lightly on her notebook, her eyes unwavering as Ethan finished his performance. She drew in a slow breath, just enough to clear the last traces of emotion. She knew this was only the first layer of the curtain, and once it fell, the man standing in the center of the courtroom in his polished uniform would have nowhere left to hide. The courtroom fell silent, a fragile moment suspended between the liar and the one waiting for the truth to be spoken aloud. Everything was about to turn. In that silence, Naomi let her eyes close for a heartbeat, as though preparing for the revelation that would leave the entire courtroom breathless. The air in the courtroom thickened as the prosecutor nodded for Ethan to conclude his statement. He stepped down with a smug stride, adjusting his collar and casting Naomi a look that said he believed he had cornered her completely. But that triumph lasted only a few fleeting seconds. The moment he sat, Judge Harrison Blake leaned forward, his gaze sharper than before. He turned toward the defense table where Naomi remained seated with a cold composure that made the entire room uneasy without knowing why. Her young attorney, Sarah Lane, rose to her feet. Her hands trembled slightly, but Naomi placed a gentle hand on her wrist, a small gesture that carried absolute confidence. In that tight silence, Sarah spoke with humble but steady clarity, and called the first witness Mr. Daniel Park. A thin man in his early 50s stepped slowly to the stand. His eyes darted nervously around the crowded room, but the moment Sarah questioned him, his voice grew firm. He was the owner of an electronics shop located only a few dozen meters from where Naomi was stopped. And exactly 3 hours earlier, he had called the law office after hearing that an unusually suspicious traffic case was heading to trial. The courtroom tilted slightly toward the large screen as Sarah played the CCTV footage from his shop. The video showed Naomi pulling over, turning off the engine, both hands placed visibly on the steering wheel, not a moment of hesitation. She spoke calmly to Ethan, her expression steady. There was no yelling, no sudden movement, no lunging toward the glove compartment as Ethan had claimed. Ethan sat below his back, beginning to stiffen. His hands clenched until they turned pale. His eyes flicked from Sarah to Naomi, and though he tried to remain composed, the tiny shifts in his facial muscles betrayed him. When the audio played, the courtroom fell into absolute silence. Ethan's voice rang out clearly, every word distinct. "How does someone like you afford to live in that neighborhood? Do you really think you belong there?" No one spoke, but unease rippled through the gallery, then reached the jury. Eyes that once trusted the badge and the uniform began to waver. Sarah stepped back, giving Mr. Park the floor. His voice was not loud, yet it sliced through the air like a blade. She did nothing wrong. He changed his tone the moment he saw her address on the paperwork. No one missed the word address. Naomi tilted her head slightly and added a short line into her notebook compact, but enough to spark a nervous shiver in Ethan's chest, because he knew exactly what had made him change his attitude that night. The prosecutor leapt up in objection, his voice sharp but lacking conviction. Judge Blake waved a hand and dismissed it. Continue. Mr. Park was allowed to step down, and when Sarah called the second witness, Miss Eleanor Brooks, the discomfort in Ethan's eyes turned into fear. Because he knew her. He remembered her voice on an autumn evening. He remembered the porch light outside the church where she had asked to review the report he filed. He remembered the tremble in her voice. When she insisted, she had not resisted. Now she stood before the court in a soft brown sweater, eyes creased with age, but her testimony was piercing. What she described did not just mirror Naomi's case, it exposed a long pattern of behavior by Ethan: unjustified stops, intimidation, falsified details in reports, always targeting people like Naomi. The courtroom went still. Ethan no longer dared lift his head. Judge Blake let out a quiet sigh, barely audible, but Naomi heard it. It was not the sigh of fatigue. It was the breath of someone realizing he was facing something far larger than a simple traffic case. Meanwhile, Naomi turned a page in her notebook and wrote a few more lines. Her pen moved with the steady, cold rhythm of a drum, signaling what was coming next. She knew the warm-up was over. Truth had entered the courtroom, but the biggest truth still lay inside the leather wallet resting beside her hand. And very soon, everything would shift in ways no one in this room was prepared to face. The courtroom fell utterly silent as Naomi stepped onto the stand. No one expected anything remarkable, only a weak rebuttal from a defendant who appeared cornered. But the moment she spoke, time in the room seemed to slow. Her voice did not shake, did not rise, did not scramble to justify anything. It was cold, sharp, low, and deliberate. She opened with a sentence that shifted the air instantly. Officer Morales' testimony contains multiple systemic inaccuracies. A murmur rippled through the gallery. The prosecutor frowned. Ethan jerked upright spine rigid, and the jurors who moments earlier had leaned subtly in his favor now locked their gaze on Naomi as though seeing her for the first time. Naomi recounted the night she was stopped with a calm so heavy it pressed against the walls. She described each step pulling over in full compliance with the law, switching off the engine, placing both hands on the steering wheel, waiting for instructions. Every detail was laid out with such clarity, neither excessive nor lacking, as if she had reviewed that moment from every angle until she memorized each breath. Judge Blake tilted his head eyes, moving from Naomi to Ethan, then back to Naomi. Something in her manner told him the room had drifted far from the narrative Ethan had constructed. When the prosecutor attempted to interrupt, Naomi did not retreat, nor did she grow irritated. She simply asked the judge whether she could continue presenting the procedural discrepancies of professional significance. The phrase made the judge pause. He allowed it. No one understood why he did, only that he felt compelled to hear more. Naomi dissected Ethan's actions with unsettling precision. She referred to his questioning of her address as an overreach of authority. She identified his tone as indicative of profiling. She explained that the gesture he claimed was threatening fell under a misapplied standard of officer safety escalation. These were terms rarely heard from a defendant, especially one accused of violent conduct. The entire courtroom seemed to tighten around her words. No one knew where she had learned this vocabulary. The prosecutor kept darting his eyes around, searching for a point of attack, but every claim Naomi made was so structurally sound, it left him nothing to grip. Ethan, meanwhile, had developed a faint red blotch creeping up his neck. He could no longer look directly at her. Naomi's composure made him feel she was dangerous in a way he could not comprehend. The jurors exchanged glances. An older man nodded slowly with each analysis Naomi offered. A younger woman scribbled furiously in her notes. Those who once believed this was a simple resisting arrest case now recognized they were witnessing something far greater. When Naomi reached the moment, Ethan had slammed his hand on her window and ordered her to step out immediately. Her voice dipped with tightly controlled emotion. She did not cry, but the tightening in her throat was enough to make several people grasp their armrests. They heard in it not just the fear of one night on the roadside, But the humiliation many people who shared her skin color had endured in silence. And then, just when everyone thought she was closing her testimony, Naomi lifted her gaze, directing it straight at Ethan. In that instant, her voice turned razor-sharp. "I never threatened you. I never resisted. And I never uttered a single word that you swore under oath to attribute to me." Ethan shot to his feet, ready to object, but the judge snapped at him to sit down. Judge Blake's eyes were heavy as stone, as if he had just witnessed something he could no longer ignore. Naomi turned to the jury. Her face held no anger. It was calm to the point of being unnerving. "I documented the entire incident using a standard method that those of us in my field are trained to follow." The courtroom erupted in whispers. What field, one juror blurted out. Naomi only smiled a brief, knowing smile. "You will find out soon." A chill shot down Ethan's spine. He could not understand why the defendant before him spoke with the authority of someone in command. But somewhere inside him, a vague dread began to take shape. Something he had never anticipated was moving toward him, growing larger with every passing second, like a shadow expanding under the light. The courtroom had not yet settled when the defense attorney rose, her voice steadier than before, strengthened by Naomi's commanding testimony. She called the next witness, someone no one, not the prosecutor nor Ethan, expected to appear at this exact moment. David Kim, the surveillance technician responsible for monitoring the traffic junction near the scene of the incident. A gentle-looking man walked to the stand carrying a small hard drive and a sealed envelope. He bowed to the judge, then explained that the city's traffic camera system had automatically recorded all activity in the area that night. David stated that the footage had never passed through the police department because under the city's updated procedures, the data must be stored by an independent monitoring unit before any request is made. The prosecutor stiffened immediately, rushing to object, but Judge Blake simply lifted his hand, signaling silence. He wanted to see the footage. Everyone wanted to see it. And the large screen lit up once more. The wide-angle camera showed Naomi pulling over immediately the moment the sirens sounded. There was no indication of fleeing or resisting orders. Ethan approached the driver's side window, his initial demeanor relatively neutral. But only a few seconds after he looked at her paperwork, the angle clearly showing her home address, his behavior shifted completely. His shoulders tensed. His voice in the ambient audio grew sharp and clipped. Hostility spread through his tone like smoke preceding a fire. The jury did not blink. When Ethan slammed his hand against the window and ordered Naomi to step out right now, a middle-aged juror shook his head without realizing it, and the young woman beside him covered her mouth. The footage continued. Naomi opened her door, slowly, hands raised to reduce tension, making no sudden moves, nothing resembling what Ethan had described. There was no reaching toward the glove compartment, no aggressive posture, no insults. Only a woman trying to remain calm, while the officer before her grew louder and more unstable by the second. Ethan swallowed hard, attempting to keep his face neutral, though sweat began forming at his temples. Judge Blake leaned forward. He looked at the screen, then at Ethan, then back at Naomi. And in that look, Naomi felt something unmistakable. He was beginning to understand. When the video ended, the courtroom fell into a silence thick as fog. Then Naomi's attorney asked David a single question. "Has this footage been altered or edited in any way?" "No. This is the original version. The city system uses an automatic authentication code. If even one frame is changed, the code will not match." One answer, powerful enough to shatter Ethan's entire fabricated story. Ethan's wrist jerked as if he instinctively wanted to stand, argue, defend himself, grasp at anything. But he could not move. Every eye in the room was aimed at him like a blade. Even the prosecutor avoided looking at him as if afraid of being associated. Sarah sat down and Naomi closed the notebook in front of her. The movement was soft, almost unnoticeable, but to Ethan, it felt like she had just shut the lid of a waiting coffin. Judge Blake rolled his pen between his fingers, then set it down, his voice low, yet echoing through the room. "Officer Morales, would you like to amend your testimony before the court proceeds?" The question cut straight through the armor Ethan believed he was wearing. He swallowed his throat dry, and in that half-second, the arrogance he once carried collapsed entirely. He realized what Naomi had been planting in the room from the moment she spoke, the awareness that they did not know who she truly was. And they certainly did not know that what they had just witnessed was only the surface layer of truth. Naomi looked at Ethan not with pride, not with cruelty, not with mockery. Simply with the calm of someone who knew everything was unfolding exactly as it should. Behind her, Sarah began opening the next set of documents, a sealed envelope marked with a red insignia that no one in the room had seen before. No one anticipated that what lay inside that envelope would be the decisive strike. And once it was revealed, everything Ethan believed he could hide would have no place left to escape. The defense attorney rose and stepped into the center of the courtroom, holding the sealed envelope, marked with a red insignia. No one knew what was inside, but the atmosphere shifted the moment she placed it on the evidence table. A thick silence spread, as if the entire room was holding its breath for what was about to unfold. Ethan leaned forward slightly, eyes locked on the envelope, his throat tightening with each swallow. He sensed disaster approaching, though he could not yet gauge its magnitude. Sarah opened the envelope slowly, deliberately, forcing every pair of eyes to follow her movements. The crisp sound of paper sliding free cut through the room. As she pulled out the stack of documents, Naomi looked directly at Ethan, while Judge Blake narrowed his eyes, a mix of curiosity and growing concern. "Your Honor," Sarah began, her voice calm but carrying a hidden blade beneath each word. "This is a certified copy from the Federal Archival System containing civil complaints filed against Officer Ethan Morales over the past 3 years. The courtroom shuddered as though someone had thrown a stone into perfectly still water. The prosecutor shot up in immediate protest, but Judge Blake raised his hand, never taking his eyes off the documents. Sarah lifted the first page, her voice steady and clear like a bell. "Complaint number 1, unlawful traffic stop behavior closely mirroring the incident involving my client. Case closed without explanation. Complaint number 2, falsifying the contents of an official report accused of fabricating resistance. Case closed. Complaint number 3, targeting residents in high-income neighborhoods without reasonable cause. Case closed." Whispers spread through the room like fire racing across dry grass. The jurors exchanged looks, their expressions shifting from uncertainty to rising alarm. Ethan fidgeted violently, switching posture, one leg twitching, hands clenched so tightly the tendons stood out. The confidence he once carried had evaporated without a trace. Naomi sat motionless, tilting her head slightly as she listened, as if every word merely confirmed what she had known for years. Sarah continued. "All complaints share one common trait: every case was settled internally with no independent review of any kind." Judge Blake turned toward Ethan. His gaze was no longer detached. It had become penetrating. Ethan tried to maintain a steady voice. They were all people with issues. I was only doing my job." a feeble line standing before a tower of truth collapsing on top of him. And it was still not the final blow. Sarah placed a small recording device on the table. This device contains audio captured by a nearby witness on the night of the incident. They overheard the final portion of the exchange between my client and Officer Morales. The room tightened as though it had shrunk. Sarah pressed play. Ethan's voice filled the courtroom, unmistakable and damning. "I know your kind. Think that a little money and that address give you the right to go wherever you want. I will write whatever I need in this report to make sure you understand you are no better than anyone else." Ethan froze. No one mistook the voice. No one believed it was edited. Judge Blake dropped his pen onto the desk, the sound sharp and cold. A middle-aged female juror whispered, "My God!" Ethan pressed his fingers to his forehead, fear flooding his eyes, with nowhere left to hide. The uniform that once felt like armor now hung on him like a heavy weight suffocating his shoulders. Everything he had built through misplaced confidence was collapsing faster than he could comprehend. Naomi watched him with an expression difficult to name. Not satisfaction, and not hatred. It was the cold recognition of someone who knew the truth was finally returning to its rightful place. Sarah sat down and gently pushed the stack of documents toward Naomi. In that moment, Naomi rested her hand on the opened envelope and bowed her head slightly as if acknowledging that the prelude had officially ended. And the thing Ethan feared most was approaching. She still had not revealed who she really was. The silence that followed stretched longer than any before it, a silence that warned the greatest storm had not yet arrived. No one managed to breathe as Judge Blake tapped his gavel lightly, signaling a pause to restore order. But order no longer existed in this courtroom. It was nothing more than a thin shell stretched over a truth ready to erupt. Ethan sat frozen as if his body had been pinned to the chair. The recording still echoed in his mind, each word tearing apart the confidence he had worn like armor for years. Naomi rose when the judge invited her to continue. No one understood how she could radiate such unnerving calm at the exact moment the entire case seemed to tilt sharply in her favor, as if she wasn't afraid of Ethan escaping, as if she still held a piece no one else had seen. She walked to the stand carrying a black leather wallet, an object she had never once opened publicly since the beginning of the trial. The jury's eyes followed every step she took. Ethan swallowed repeatedly. The prosecutor, who had once brimmed with confidence, kept staring down at his papers, avoiding every glance that might reach him. Naomi drew a slow breath and began speaking. Not about what happened the night she was stopped, but about what happened after she went home. "I spent the entire night reviewing the material I collected," she said, her voice steady but weighted. "Not because I was afraid of being convicted, but because I was afraid of something else. I was afraid that what I had been tracking for months was more accurate than I wanted to believe." The room seemed to hold its breath. Naomi explained that she had reopened several civil rights files connected to the Riverside Police Department, files the public never learned about, and that were never mentioned anywhere. She described patterns in the traffic stops, strange similarities in Ethan's reports and cases involving a few other officers. "There is a model," she said. "A model targeting people whose appearance they believe does not belong in the neighborhoods they live in." Ethan clenched his hands so tightly the knuckles turned white. He knew exactly what she meant, and that was why his fear kept growing. Naomi continued, her voice slowing on the emphasis, as if she wanted each word carved into the ceiling of the courtroom. "I have long suspected something. that what happened that night was not random, that Officer Morales did not react because he felt danger. He reacted because his sense of authority was threatened by a woman who did not fit the mold he created. Ethan shot to his feet. "She is making this up." Judge Blake slammed his gavel. "Sit down." Ethan collapsed back into his seat, eyes red with anger and fear. Naomi did not look at him. She continued speaking, her tone slow and sharp as a blade. And because of that, she said, "I did what I was trained to do. I documented the entire incident according to protocol, not the protocol of an ordinary citizen." The courtroom held its breath. Naomi opened the leather wallet. Ethan leaned forward involuntarily, as if pulled by a force he could not resist. The prosecutor pulled back. The jurors straightened instinctively. From inside the wallet, Naomi drew out a stack of laminated identification cards. No one spoke, but every gaze tightened. Naomi lifted her head, her voice deep and weighted. "I am not simply a woman falsely accused during an unlawful traffic stop." She raised the card. "I am a senior federal inspector with the Civil Rights Division of the United States Department of Justice." The courtroom exploded. A few people gasped aloud. The jurors looked as if they could not believe their own eyes. The prosecutor's mouth fell open, but no words emerged. And Ethan, his face collapsed inward as though someone had yanked all the air from his lungs. Naomi continued, her voice stronger now. "Today's trial is not just my case. It is evidence that a law enforcement officer lied under oath, deliberately distorting the truth about a federal investigator operating under a confidential assignment." Ethan stood again, but this time his legs trembled so violently he could not remain standing. He sank back down. Naomi placed her identification card on the stand. Her touch was so light it should have made no sound, but to Ethan it echoed like a steel door slamming shut behind someone who had just been sentenced. "And I submit to the court the complete federal investigative file on the pattern of abuse of authority involving Officer Morales and several others within this department." No one moved. No one spoke. Because they all understood the moment Naomi opened that leather wallet, the trial no longer belonged to the judge, the prosecution, or the defendant. It belonged to the Department of Justice. And Ethan Morales realized he had walked straight into the jaws of the beast, led there by his own sworn lies. The courtroom sank into a silent chaos as Naomi set the federal identification card on the wooden surface. A long, breath-stopping moment passed before Judge Blake leaned forward. His fingers interlaced his expression, doubtful yet unable to hide his astonishment. He asked Naomi to clarify, though even he sensed that what was unfolding was no longer a conventional trial. It was a sudden transfer of power, a reversal no one had anticipated. Naomi opened the black case beneath the table and withdrew a thick stack of documents sealed under federal protocol. She placed them down and slid them toward the judge. "This is the full body of evidence I collected over 18 months of covert investigation in the Riverside area," she said, her voice low but firm, carrying a weight that made Ethan stop breathing. "It includes every instance in which Officer Morales falsified reports, every instance in which he committed perjury in prior proceedings, and data showing a systematic pattern of targeting residents of color living in high-income neighborhoods." The sound of pages shifting filled the courtroom as the judge opened to the first page. He paused at the opening line, his brow furrowing. Everyone could feel the shift in him, moving from doubt to understanding, then to restrained outrage. A juror raised a hand to her mouth while the person beside her leaned in to catch a glimpse of the document's title, yet no one dared utter a sound. The prosecutor attempted once more to object, but his voice lacked its former weight. Naomi turned toward him and answered with a single sentence that made him sit down instantly. "This is material under federal authority. The court is required to receive it." The certainty in her tone silenced him, as though he finally realized he was interfering in a battle far above his rank. Ethan remained motionless, eyes wide. He was no longer the storyteller, no longer the central figure in a narrative he believed he had scripted. Now he was merely watching his own downfall. Each document Naomi presented felt like a blow landing directly on him. Faces he had once lied about flashed before him, cases he thought he buried, the twisted satisfaction he had taken from cornering others the way he pleased. And for the first time he felt that very sensation turning back on him, tightening around him like a noose. Naomi did not look at Ethan. She continued her presentation with perfect composure. "I came to Riverside under an internal oversight mandate. My traffic stop was not random. I had been tracking operational patterns across several officers for an extended period. I was waiting for the moment they revealed their true conduct. And on that night, Officer Morales did exactly as I anticipated." A weary sigh rose from the back row, but no one turned to look. All eyes were locked on the two people standing across from each other, Naomi and Ethan. One standing steady with authority, truth, and discipline. One sinking into the shadow of his own making. Judge Blake closed the documents and placed a hand on his forehead, inhaling with difficulty, as though he had just witnessed the depth of a chasm deeper than anyone imagined. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice slightly hoarse, "I need to confirm. All of this material has been approved by the Department of Justice for presentation in court, yes, and you are operating under the supervision of the Civil Rights Inspection Office, yes." Ethan leapt to his feet. No, this is impossible. You are the defendant. You set me up." His voice cracked like glass shattering on stone. Naomi turned toward him, meeting his eyes for the first time since revealing her identity. It was not hatred. It was not sympathy. It was the look of someone who had once given him the chance to choose correctly and watched him choose the fall instead. "I did not set you up," Naomi said, her voice slow and sharp like a freshly honed blade. "You walked into your own trap. I merely documented it." Ethan collapsed into his chair. The courtroom went so still, it felt as though even sound itself was hesitant to intrude. Naomi turned back to the judge. "Your Honor, I would also like to state that these documents represent only the initial portion of the investigation. The remaining materials, including internal reports, lists of altered case files, and data pulled from the department's system, will be delivered directly to the United States Attorney's Office before the end of today." At that moment, everyone in the room arrived at the same conclusion. This battle was no longer confined to the boundaries of a routine trial. The authority Ethan once relied upon to intimidate, manipulate, and conceal had evaporated. Naomi had not only proven that he lied under oath, she had proven that the very standard he embodied was being crushed under a power far greater. No one spoke another word, because they all understood that what came next would not be spoken. It would be the judgment awaiting a man who once believed he was untouchable. The air in the courtroom seemed to freeze as Judge Blake called for a 5-minute recess to review the federal documents, but no one moved. Every person in the room was anchored to their seat by the sense that they were witnessing a turning point the small town of Riverside had never imagined in its entire history. Ethan sat collapsed in his chair, both hands buried in his hair, struggling to control his breathing. The confidence, the arrogance, the way he had always looked at others as if they were beneath him, all of it had evaporated, leaving behind a man drowning in the lies he had built. Naomi stood on the opposite side of the room, not far in distance, but, for Ethan, it felt like a chasm. She said nothing. She did not need to. Her silence was proof that the game was over, and Ethan was merely resisting the inevitable blow that had already begun its descent. When the judge returned to the bench, the gravity in his expression silenced the room at once. He held the stack of documents and spoke in a tone few had ever heard from him, a tone layered with anger and disappointment. What has been presented here is not simply professional misconduct. This is intentional systemic civil rights violation. And Officer Morales, you are facing accusations far more severe than anything you have ever imposed on others. Ethan opened his mouth, but no sound emerged. His throat was so dry, it felt sealed shut. Naomi stepped forward, not to the witness stand this time, but to her case. She retrieved a small device and placed it on the evidence table. This, she said, her voice steady as a federal extraction of the internal report Officer Morales attempted to modify 2 days after the incident. The prosecutor jerked his head up. He altered a report. Naomi nodded, then activated the device. The large screen displayed a document filled with edits lines, crossed-out paragraphs, rewritten language, manipulated to paint Naomi as the aggressor. Every change showed a timestamp, a user code, and the access location. Ethan clawed at the edge of the table, his face twisted. No, that wasn't. I didn't. The system glitched. But Naomi cut him off before he could assemble another excuse. Our system does not glitch, she replied evenly. And this log was transmitted to the central server the moment you pressed save. You cannot delete it. You cannot alter it, and you cannot hide it. A juror, the same man who had once looked skeptical of Naomi, now leaned fully toward the judge. He whispered to the person beside him loud enough for nearby seats to hear. He didn't just lie. He tampered with state records. Ethan held his head in his hands, shaking. He had abused his power for years, but never had anyone stood before him with enough calm to burn down the entire wall he had built around himself. The judge struck his gavel 3 times. The court will consider the request to forward the full case to the United States Attorney's Office. However, before we proceed, he looked directly at Ethan. I will give Officer Morales the opportunity to explain these inconsistencies. Ethan stood, but his legs trembled so violently he had to grip the stand to remain upright. He stared at Naomi, but she refused to look back. That alone made him feel unbearably small. She is an agent, Ethan stuttered. She was investigating me. She wanted to destroy me. She set me up. The judge cut him off his tone, dark as steel. Officer Morales, Miss Carter did not set you up. She was executing a federal assignment. You destroyed your own honor and career by abusing your authority, maligning citizens, and committing perjury under oath. The word perjury struck Ethan like a hammer. He collapsed back into the seat, hands covering his face, breathing like a man pulled from deep water. Naomi watched him silently, showing no triumph, no smile, no tremor. Only the deep dry well of someone who had seen too much injustice to be surprised by any of this. She stepped forward, her voice clear and resonant. I do not seek to destroy anyone. But I will not allow any person to use public authority to crush others, especially when they assume their victims will have no voice." The room fell completely still. Ethan looked at her, his eyes red, filled with fear, confusion, and dawning panic. But what hurt him most was not the evidence. It was the realization that the woman he had once viewed as an easy target not only surpassed him, she wielded a kind of authority he had never even touched. And this reckoning was not over. Because Naomi still had one final piece. She had not revealed the piece that would erase the last shred of hope Ethan was desperately clinging to. Naomi stepped toward the evidence table once more, this time carrying the small silver USB drive she had not touched since the start of the trial. She set it down softly, gently enough to seem insignificant, but to Ethan the sound landed like metal striking stone. He lifted his head slightly, his bloodshot eyes tracking the tiny object, as a sinking realization spread through him. Whatever hope he had left was about to be crushed. Judge Blake looked at Naomi. "Miss Carter, what is this?" Naomi answered with a calm so cold it raised the hair on the back of several necks. "The final document, and the one I deliberately saved for this moment. Because it does not concern only me and Officer Morales. It concerns the entire operational structure of the Riverside Police Department." A ripple of whispers slid across the courtroom floor like a serpent beneath the wooden boards. The prosecutor stepped back half a pace, and his assistant stared wide-eyed, unsure whether to prepare an objection or brace for what was coming. The jurors leaned forward in unison, as if they feared missing even a single breath of the moment. Naomi plugged the USB into the computer. The large screen lit up. A list appeared, not a handful of files, but dozens. Each row contained a name. Beside it, the time of the traffic stop, the stated reason, the conclusion, and one final column, video evidence lost or body cam failure. Every entry was from the past 3 years. Every one involved residents of color living in high-income neighborhoods. And in the column listing, the involved Officer Morales' name appeared so many times it spread across the screen like a dark stain. Ethan gripped the arm of his chair with a strangled sound. No, Naomi, don't. But Naomi remained steady, unmoving. "I compiled this data over many months, and under the new federal regulations, any unusual pattern in the operations of a police unit must be reported to the Department of Justice. This is a pattern, a dangerous one, and it cannot be hidden any longer." Judge Blake turned away from the screen, gripping the armrest of his chair as if trying to steady himself against his own rising fury. "Officer Morales," he said, "can you explain this pattern? File audits. Workload imbalance system error. Is there any reasonable explanation?" Ethan opened his mouth, but only broken noises came out. He sounded like a man dragged from deep underwater, inhaling foam instead of air. I was just doing my job. I didn't know it wasn't my fault. I wasn't the only one." Naomi looked directly at him, her gaze carrying the weight of someone who knew every escape route had now been sealed. "You are right. You were not the only one, but you were the one who left the most traces. And you were the one who committed perjury in front of a federal inspector investigating the exact area you operated in." Ethan collapsed into his seat as if a rope had been cut, his fingernails dug into the wooden edge until blood rose beneath them. The silence in the room was unlike any silence before. It was heavy, suffocating, like a sky preparing to fall. Naomi continued. "And one more thing, the entire room jolted. Every piece of data on this USB has already been transmitted to the Department of Justice server. What I presented today is only a backup copy." That sentence struck harder than anything before it. Ethan's head snapped up, his desperate eyes widening until the whites turned red. He knew exactly what that meant. No more deleting, no more reversing, no more internal intervention. Everything had slipped out of his reach long before he even realized it. A juror exhaled sharply as if resurfacing after nearly drowning. Another whispered she didn't just defend herself. She exposed the entire system. Judge Blake took a moment before rising. When he spoke, his voice no longer carried only the authority of the courtroom. It carried the weight of a legal system being forced to wake up. The court acknowledges this evidence, and I am ordering immediate notification to the United States Attorney's Office regarding the material presented. Ethan lurched to his feet like a man being dragged from a cliff's edge. "You can't do this. I will lose everything. You're destroying my life." Naomi turned, and for the first time in the entire trial, her voice carried the frost of someone who had witnessed too much suffering to look away. "You are not losing everything because of me. You are losing everything because of what you did to people who had no power to defend themselves. I am simply the first voice loud enough for them to finally be heard." Ethan stared at her as if she were a mirror, reflecting a truth he could never escape. And in that moment, he understood that the mirror did more than reveal the mask he had worn for years. It exposed the part of himself he had tried to bury. The judge announced that the court would enter its final phase. Naomi returned to her seat, placing her hand on her case. No smile. No triumph. Only the calm of someone who knew that justice does not arrive through shouting, but through the steady resolve of those who refuse to bow. And everyone in the room understood one thing: the ending ahead would not mark the fall of a single man, but the awakening of an entire system. Judge Blake struck his gavel, once then looked directly at the jury with an expression weighted like lead. He instructed them to retire to deliberate, but everyone knew this was no longer a case shrouded in uncertainty. They entered the deliberation room for less than half an hour, and when they returned, there was not a trace of doubt on any face. The foreperson stood, and her voice echoed through every corner of the courtroom. "We unanimously find the defendant Naomi Carter not guilty on all charges." A wave of relieved breaths swept the room, but Naomi did not smile. She only lowered her head slightly, as though the verdict was not a victory, but simply a necessary step towards something far greater. Ethan sat hollow and motionless, his eyes vacant, as if the weight of truth itself had snapped his spine. But the trial was not over. Judge Blake signaled to the court officers. The rear doors opened. 3 federal agents entered with solemn precision, dark suits, sharp under the harsh courtroom lights. Their arrival silenced the room. They walked directly toward Ethan. Ethan Morales, the lead agent, declared, his voice crisp and final. "You are under arrest on federal charges of severe civil rights violations, systematic perjury, obstruction of justice, and abuse of authority under the color of law." Ethan jumped to his feet, his chair clattering behind him. "No, wait, I can explain." But his words broke apart as 2 agents seized his arms, fastening cold steel cuffs around his wrists. He struggled, but no one in the room had any desire to hear another word from the man whose own actions had exposed the rot in his career. The judge watched with an expression more sorrowful than angry. "Officer Morales," he said slowly, "every action done in darkness eventually steps into the light. Ethan was escorted down the aisle between the seats, past people who had once feared him and now watched with anger relief or quiet mourning for the pain they had carried. He called out to Naomi one last time, his voice cracking. "You destroyed me." Naomi rose, meeting his desperate eyes with calm. "Not me. The truth did." Ethan was taken from the courtroom, and only when the door shut behind him did the room exhale as if an enormous weight had finally been lifted from the hearts of Riverside's residents. Naomi gathered her documents. Sarah wrapped her in a trembling hug of relief, but Naomi only placed a steady hand on her shoulder, carrying the composure of someone accustomed to standing between justice and the shadows. Judge Blake stepped down from the bench and approached her. "Miss Carter," he said quietly, "I have served on this bench for many years, but rarely have I seen a case pull an entire system into the open. This community owes you more than gratitude." Naomi shook her head. "I only did my job. The rest belongs to the Department of Justice and to the people willing to stand up." Outside the courthouse, when Naomi stepped into the sunlight, dozens of Riverside residents were waiting. Faces that once held fear, helplessness, and silence now looked at her with something closer to hope. An elderly woman stepped forward, eyes glistening. "Thank you for making them hear us." Naomi offered a gentle smile and bowed her head. "The truth has always been there. It only needed someone to bring it into the light." A warm breeze swept through the crowd, carrying their voices in a soft whisper. But Naomi did not linger. She walked toward her car, the black leather case still firm in her hand. She knew the battle had never ended with a single arrest. True justice demanded more. It demanded endurance, courage, and sometimes the willingness to stand alone against a storm. But that was the path she had chosen. And today in Riverside, that path had protected not just one person, but an entire community long denied a voice. As Naomi closed her car door, she glanced at her federal identification card resting on the seat beside her. It could not erase the pain carried by those who had been mistreated, but it could shield them from those who believed power was a weapon meant to harm. And in that brief moment, Naomi understood something both powerful and profound. The next battle was already waiting for her, but this time justice was no longer behind her. It was walking beside her. From the perspective of a civil rights expert, today's story reminds us that truth never reveals itself on its own. It needs people who are willing to stand up to confront what others avoid and to shine light into the dark corners a system once tried to hide. Naomi Carter did not prevail because of luck. She prevailed through discipline, through knowledge, and through the unwavering resolve of someone who understands that justice exists only when there are people willing to defend it. If you believe stories exposing abuses of power, like this one deserve to be told, make sure to like and subscribe so you do not miss the next journeys ahead. Every interaction you make becomes a voice in support of transparency and fairness. And before you leave the video, drop a very short comment, no more than 3 words, as a shared reminder that truth still matters. Comment, "Wake up now."